for a number of reasons, actually. But I'll pick out two. One is obviously developments in the world economy, and particularly developments in the Gulf and the Middle East conflict, which I don't think actually directly increases the sort of structural issues that we've identified in the past, but obviously increases the risk of things crystallizing, and also I think increases the impact when were things to crystallize. So that's the first thing. The second thing, which I have written to you about in the last week, is I would say is the big new development, which is the news on frontier AI and the cyber risk consequences of that. So I think, unfortunately, it's a sort of unambiguous yes to your question.
Well, we'll come to AI in more detail later. Now, obviously, the conflict in the Middle East, we keep having a ceasefire, and then it's not a ceasefire. What's your prediction for how that's going to impact the long-term situation in the UK economy?
Well, if you'd asked me this question a week ago, I'd have probably given you a slightly different answer. I'd have said a week ago, look, actually things, if you go back to the hearing we had on monetary policy a few weeks ago, I think I would have said, look, I think things are panning out at that stage, probably at the lower end of the three scenarios that we had painted in the MPR. But I would have added the very strong caveat to that it seemed to me that the situation remained unstable, and the sort of the ceasefire was fragile. Sadly, that's come to pass, obviously. I think where I am now, for the moment, is that obviously that as I say, that instability has come to pass. I don't certainly feel qualified to judge how long this is going to go on for in terms of this resumption of hostilities and how it's going to end. But it underlines that this is going to be an unstable process for the foreseeable future. Now, energy prices have come down. As of a week ago, they were sitting a bit above where they were before the crisis. They're now somewhat further above, but they're still obviously. Crude oil prices are well down on their peak. We are also seeing, I think, continued fairly soft evidence on the pass-through into UK prices, but we'll get another inflation number next week. The one, however, other caveat I would add, which I don't think gets enough coverage, is that although crude oil prices have come down, the prices of refined products have not come down as much. So we're talking about things like gasoline and diesel at this point, which of course are the end products. So those are the things that matter in terms of the end products. And one or two of the reasons for that in the global context are that there's a story around China and obviously a story around Russia. China has substantially reduced its imports of crude over the last couple of months. That's been interpreted, therefore, as a sort of softening of the market and a sort of reduced demand story. But they've also, as far as we can tell, reduced their exports of refined products substantially. So in a sense, they haven't necessarily changed their balance, and that is tightening the market in the global market for refined products. And the other thing, of course, obviously, and this is obviously, good news in other respects, that obviously Russia's had a serious blow to its production capacity from what Ukraine has done. So I would make that caveat that we all spend all our time quoting crude oil prices, but you have to be a bit careful because I don't think refined product prices have come down as much.
And one of the challenges, of course, is the damage to the infrastructure in the Middle East, which can take 8 months minimum to get. Once there is a ceasefire that holds, it's going to get things back on track. What modelling is the bank doing to look at the impact on the UK economy in the short to medium term?
Well, we obviously talk a lot to people in the industry, and we obviously talk a lot to our counterparts in the Gulf area. I spend a lot of time talking to my counterparts. I think the story there is, take oil and gas separately. On the oil front, there hasn't been as much physical damage to the infrastructure, the supply production infrastructure. Obviously, the blockages in the Gulf are another matter. So I think the message we get from the Gulf states is that if they can ship the stuff out, then they will resume production very rapidly, and they have at least up until last week, they had resumed production rapidly. They are also have got quite big plans, which they're already executing, for building new pipelines to get round the Strait of Hormuz, to get it to ports which are south of the Strait. But that will obviously take some time to do. On gas, I think certainly the story we get from the Qataris, who are the people who matter, obviously, in that market, are, I mean, they're quite precise. I think they say about if I remember rightly, about 83% of the supply is intact. The 17% that was hit by the Iranians in the attack some months ago now will take longer to bring back. They again too have got quite big plans for increasing their overall output of gas, but that again they're talking about sort of 2029, 2030, I think, for that. So I say they're clearly very determined to get supply back onto the market, but obviously what we're seeing in the Strait now is going to impact that.
Okay, so it's a rocky period ahead. I'll come to some of the witnesses on that in a moment, but we're about to have our 7th Prime Minister in 10 years. We've had a lot of change at the top there. So, we're talking about internationally, but domestically, though, do you think those changes and all that upheaval is good for financial stability?
Well, I'm not going to comment on obviously on what's happening in politics.
Well, I mean, I suppose, let me
say
it's about the stability point.
No, but two things which are important. One, as the last few days have demonstrated, the big driver of moves in financial markets is actually not what happens in the UK. It's global. It's the global setting. What I would say, however, is that I think what the evidence does indicate is that the UK situation is sort of supported by, on our side, obviously, monetary stability and financial stability, and I think on the other side is the fiscal framework. And obviously, you did see a bit of movement in markets briefly on the fiscal, on news on the fiscal framework, but that came back quite quickly.
If you were to be, you can't give private advice to us in public, but we've got a new Prime Minister, a new government, a refreshed government, I suppose you could say, coming in next week. What would be your top tips in order to make sure that we have financial stability, or their best chance of maintaining financial stability in the UK?
Well, I think that the overall message I would give is that I think the big issue is growth in the economy. So I think we can do all we can on financial stability, and we'll come on to this, no doubt. I do actually think there are signs of a very resilient financial system. We described them in the financial stability report, and in two respects. One is, I think for instance, the core banking system is resilient, and I'm sure we'll come on to discuss that. But also, when you look at debt levels in the economy, if you look at debt levels in both the household sector and the corporate sector, I mean, they are not stretched actually at the moment. So that's that gives us an underlying picture of resilience. What I think is much more challenging is that we've had low growth in the economy now for best part of probably 16, 17 years actually. This is not a story about any one government, by the way. This is a general story. It's not a political story in that sense, but it is a story about UK growth. I've made a number of speeches recently on this subject. I think it's important because it's the critical structural issue. And as far as I will, in a sense, go into fiscal policy, which is not far, what I have said is, look, it is interesting that if we did a simple, naive sort of counterfactual and said, imagine that we'd had the growth rate for the last 17 years that we had for the preceding period, which was a potential and actual growth rate of around 2.5% a year. So we've been around 1.5 for the last 17. So imagine you add that 1% back in. You've got the same shocks. So you have exactly the same fiscal policy for every government, not changing fiscal policy. You've got the same shocks: COVID, Brexit, Ukraine, Gulf. They all happen. Where would we be? Naively, where would we be today on debt, on the public sector debt level? It would be about, I think that number was about 10 percentage points lower. Now, therefore, you haven't sort of solved all problems, but I would argue I think it would be a very different debate.
Okay, that's very helpful. And one of the there was a strong drive here in the UK for deregulation of the banking sector to promote growth, and when we meet with those financial institutions, they're keen to see that and constantly stress that we're a long way from 2008.
Yeah.
Do you think that emphasis on deregulation and growth pose a risk for financial stability? Because sometimes that's the tension that's put to us by other people, that the bank is holding back growth because you don't want to see that deregulation? Is that a fair comment?
My overall view on this is we will not get growth if we don't have financial stability. I mean, I think we can point to episodes in history which support that view. So financial stability and monetary stability are key underpinnings of growth. Does that mean, however, that every one of our rules in financial regulation is perfectly formed? No. I mean, it doesn't. Would that ever be the case? No, because the world always moves on. So do we support a process of review? Yes. I do think that where I do differ from some of the arguments that are put is, let's take the banking system, because it's important. The key to actually the banking system supporting the economy is to have a system that is earning returns which more than cover its cost of capital, which means that they can invest their returns to support lending into the economy, and that is the best system we can have. I think after a long period of rebuilding capital in the banking system post the financial crisis, we actually are now in that situation. They earn more than their return on capital, and you can see that in the market numbers. You can see it in the price-to-book ratios. Therefore, it seems to me they have a choice they can make as to whether they reinvest earnings into their own business or they pay them back to shareholders, and that's a choice that should be made in the market. We were not in that position before. The reason I push back is that some of the debates I find, and you read the debate, it's as if we've got this sort of fixed amount of bank capital, and therefore we must sort of lighten regulation to allow it to sort of be spread around further. And it isn't fixed. It isn't fixed at all. I mean, I'd say a healthy banking system will earn its returns, and they can be reinvested into the economy. Okay,
well, they've heard that. Mr. Krosner, from your perspective, let's take a look at the Fed. Does a awash-less Fed mean... What does it mean really for financial stability globally and in the UK? Do you think there's going to be any changes as a result?
So Kevin Warsh and I went through our confirmation hearing together and to join the Fed, and we sat next to each other for years during the global financial crisis. So he has been battle tested in financial stability, and he's very aware of and sensitive to those issues. So I'm obviously, no one can guarantee that there will not be a financial crisis, but he is aware of and very sensitive to those issues. Obviously, there's a lot of change in financial regulation in the U.S. And a new proposal related to the Basel III endgame, which I think is providing much more effective regulation. And I think it's very important not to confuse effective regulation with deregulation. We want to make sure that regulations are effective, that they reach the financial stability goals, but also that banks can intermediate, that they can actually do lending, they can do what they're supposed to do in the economy. And I think that's the key motivation for what's going on at the Fed now in thinking about financial regulation. And I think from the more macro perspective, Kevin is going to be very much aware of those issues, is not going to want to do anything that is going to expose the time that he is at the Fed to a financial crisis. But of course, sometimes events overtake what one wants, and certainly when I was at the Fed, I had studied a lot about the 1930s. Ben Bernanke had said a lot about the 1930s. I don't think any of us thought we would be in a 30s-like crisis, but having studied that period, that was very helpful, and I think Kevin, as well as others who have been through that period, will make sure that we're best prepared and will be able to respond to try to minimize the damage if there is some sort of shock that causes a crisis.
Thank you, that's very helpful from someone who's so close to Mr. Walsh. Jim Dixon.
Thank you, Dame Meg. Just looking at other risks that we're facing at the moment, we're just at the end of or sort of in the middle of the third wave of extreme weather of this year. So clearly climate change is sort of front and centre for all of us on thinking about the way in which the country and the world is developing. Would you say that climate change is now a bigger risk than you'd previously estimated? I think when the Governor came to us previously, you said it was sort of one of a number of risks, obviously, but it had slightly receded in terms of the extent to which it was something that you had as one of our primary risks. Would you say the recent focus on climate change has changed your view on that at all?
Well, I was making a relative point. Wasn't making a point about the absolute level of climate risk. I was making a relative point. I'm going back to the chair's first question. To me, given what we've seen on, for instance, on frontier AI over the last few months, I sort of have to make that point again. I mean, look, I'm not a climate scientist myself, so I'm not going to venture an opinion on what we can conclude from what we've seen in the last few weeks. But we've obviously had Europe has had a very strong period of very hot weather. I think it does remind us that there are very clear risks from climate. Yeah.
And either the Governor or other members of the panel, does the sort of climate change we're seeing, does it impact on financial institutions in a way that we should be taking notice of? Would anyone want to, Mr. Benjamin, perhaps?
So the channels in which climate change affect financial stability haven't changed. They remain very present. They are risk to banks, they are risk to insurers, and they are risk to core markets from climate change. This hasn't changed, and part of our analysis is to gradually embed this analysis into the mainstream of how we test financial stability.
And we've still got sort of strong teams of staff at the bank looking at those issues and understanding the analysis that you're talking about. Because I think the Governor, last time we spoke, you said there were now, and you accepted there were now fewer staff perhaps working on those issues, and that might indicate a sort of a kind of lesser emphasis on them, which was perhaps a bit concerning.
No, again, I make this point. We have to actually, allocate our resources to reflect sort of the relative risks as well. And for instance, AI has come up the league table very rapidly.
We'll come on to AI momentarily. Catherine West, MP.
Thank you very much, Dame Meg. On the point of AI, what assessment has the bank done on the needs around water, particularly internationally, thinking of countries like Malaysia, where it's such a big part of the economy now, but the physical needs around water, etc., that will, if not handled correctly, could have an impact on economic stability. What assessment?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure we're the experts on that one particularly, to be honest.
Mr. Benjamin.
There's one aspect.
It's good to have an expert in your organisation.
I'm not an expert either, but there is one aspect in which, and it is related to AI, in which the availability of water supply does affect those developments. It is we've all heard about the very large increases in the infrastructure of data centers that are being planned to develop AI capabilities. Those large data centers will require water supply in order to cool down the production line. The needs for water are large from that, and one of the questions are whether the water infrastructure will be sufficient to meet the needs for those developments at the pace that is currently embedded in the expectations of the markets.
What assessment has the Bank of England done on the demand on the grid for AI in the UK, and what impact that might have on financial stability? If certain infrastructure projects don't go ahead, but AI is demanding that...
Yeah, can I make 2 points? I mean, I think it comes back to this question of growth. So if, and I do subscribe to this view that, because I do think technology, I made this point about lower growth over the last sort of 17 years. I do think technology is part of this, because I think in the long run, technology is one of the drivers of growth. I think we've probably globally been somewhat between sort of technology cycles. So we had the internet cycle, internet ICT cycle. I think the next cycle is likely to be some combination of AI and robotics. So I think this question about, grid capacity and data center capacity is relevant here in terms of supporting growth. The other point I make, actually, and this is a point I have to be honest, I'm not, not being an expert in this field, I hadn't appreciated until going around the country and talking to people who are closer to this, that there is also a question of what's called access to clean power supply. Now, I'm using clean in a slightly different context to the environmental point here. It's actually the quality of the power supply. In other words, the sort of having a sort of very high quality and very continuous power supply. Some people have made the point to me, and I think this is on their own at the moment. Renewables don't on their own give that quality, that clean power supply. They can be a big part of it, but they don't completely solve that problem. You need a base load of other power to make sure you've got that clean power supply. So again, I think in thinking of, and that's true for data centers. So I think thinking about that, then I think there does need to be thinking about how you ensure that we've got that mix of power supply.
Thank you very much. John Glenn MP.
Yes, can I turn to the decision to ease the leverage ratio by 0.2 percentage points? I want to try and understand the range of views that exist on this, because I understand that it appears to be a split decision, and the quote is, most judge that the benefits of the proposed changes outweigh the costs. It would be useful to understand what the range of views were, and how meaningful that range is in terms of decisions. We start with you, Governor.
Yes, I'm happy to do that. Just to put it into context, I mean, I think the announcements we've made on the leverage ratio are, in my view, really about sort of cleaning up some of the issues around the leverage ratio. There was a particular issue where we'd made some changes back in 2019, which I think had created an anomaly, which was particularly affecting the large domestic banks. And that's important because they are the people who make, the highest proportion of loans into the UK economy, and it had left them facing a higher leverage requirement than was I think justified. So I think cleaning that point up was important. We have also, I think, increased the buffer usability in the leverage ratio, which I think also is important because it's exactly consistent with how we operate the risk-weighted ratio. Now, the one thing I would say is, of course, the risk-weighted regime and the leverage regime are not additive; they're parallel.
Yep.
That's important. So, we'd made some changes to the risk-weighted regime when we were here, and we talked about them in December.
Yep.
These are changes in the sort of the parallel regime. Now, the question, though, is this. So I think those things, for me, those things were all sensible things to do. The challenge we've got, and this is why there's some quite important words in the announcement, which I'll come to, is that we've got an issue with leverage in another context, which is leverage in financial markets. We've talked about this, I think, at previous hearings in the context of particularly of government debt markets. What we've seen in the period since the last hearing and in recent months is also a growth in leverage in equity market leverage. So in hedge fund leverage in equity markets, also in leverage in exchange traded funds. So there's a further growth in that world. Now it's all leverage, but it's a different context for leverage. But these two things are connected in the sense that the banking system is the ultimate sort of provider of liquidity, and therefore there are exposures between these parts of the system. So I think the question that for me, the question that we rightly debated at length in the committee was, is the better way, if we think we need to do something in that market leverage regime, is it better to do it in the banking world or in the market world? Is it better to tackle this market leverage question in the market sort of regulation world, if you like, or in the banking regulation world? Now, my own view, it's a personal view, I think it's better to do it in the market world, but we've got to land that because we've put out some ideas, got mixed responses, I'm not surprised. But you'll see that, final thing I'll say, you'll see that we've included some language which actually means we're going to do a bit of further work before we finalise these changes, which is exactly to this point. And it's particularly to say, do we think these changes might actually increase the market leverage risk? And frankly, the additional question will be, if so, but it's a question we've already got, what are we going to do about it in the market leverage world? Or do we do something in the banking leverage world? So I think there's sensible changes to make, though it's in their own right, but we have got this outstanding question about what we do about market leverage.
Okay, so who can help me understand what a slightly complementary view to that is amongst the witnesses this morning?
Mr. Blythe.
Yeah,
Thank you.
so I think the aim of the change to the leverage ratio framework to fix this idiosyncrasy that was the result of an increase in the countercyclical buffer in 2019. There was an offset in the risk-weighted stack of capital. There was an increase in the countercyclical leverage buffer. There was not an offset in the leverage stack. So that was a discrepancy, and that disproportionately affected the domestically systemically important banks. So I think there was unanimity on the committee that was something to fix, and that's what's been achieved by this package. There's also a broad view that we want to be getting the overall balance of the risk-weighted capital requirements and the leverage capital requirements correct. The other view is that in addition to fixing the discrepancy for the DSIBs, the domestic, which makes a lot of sense and will support lending into the UK economy, there's also a slight reduction in leverage ratio requirements for some other institutions, and that could potentially lead to further provision of leverage into markets. So that's the question about cost and benefit. To the governor's point, I agree that there are mechanisms within the markets, in particular haircuts or margining on repo, that would actually be, I think, very effective for providing stability in markets that can be in some ways arbitrarily levered if you have no haircut on a repo transaction. And the leverage ratio won't fix that if you have essentially no haircuts on a repo. That's arbitrary leverage. So that's that was the balance in my view of the view.
Yes, thank you. So we had an excellent discussion that I think got us to a very good outcome. Exactly as the governor and Stephen have said, key motivation was to sort of make the leverage ratio more effective and make sure that it's doing what we want it to do, which is to prevent excess leverage in the banking system. But I also believe that this is not the right tool to try to deal with market leverage. Things like haircuts or potentially centrally cleared transactions are the best way to try to deal with that. And so I think that what we were doing is trying to make sure that we had a lot of things that could be released in a crisis. Getting back to the previous question, that's a very effective way to try to make sure that banks can continue to intermediate during a crisis and provide both support in the crisis and more rapid recovery. And so a 20 basis point change in the leverage ratio does not seem to be material to me in changing the ability of banks to either provide leverage more broadly, just within the domestic economy or more broadly, and we have much better targeted instruments. So making the capital stack, much more of the capital stack, releasable, that also is something that is very helpful in achieving not only the financial, we obviously have our main objective being financial stability, but also in providing support for a secondary objective on credit provision and growth, because that's something that will allow the banks potentially to reduce the so-called management buffer that they hold above and beyond the required minima. Now, of course, they're always going to hold something beyond that. They shouldn't be running right at the edge. But when there's a lack of predictability, when there's a lack of clarity about what is releasable, how much it has to be rebuilt, how that's going to operate, that leads them to hold a bigger buffer against that. And I think the approach that we've taken will help to reduce that. So make the leverage ratio more effective without in any way affecting the from my perspective, affecting financial stability and not addressing the market risk issues, which we'll do through separate means.
Can I just come on to the decision about lowering the capital requirement from 14% of risk-weighted assets to 13%? Because I think there are two broad set of views there. There are those that obviously think that this is where does the benefit go in terms of to the banks or and their shareholders, or to the economy as a whole. But there's also, I think, still significant dissent amongst many banks over what is the actual net effect of this, because there are so many caveats that the notional 13% is never met because of all the different elements that go into it. And people then say, well, if you look at the bolder measures made in the US, we are not really getting to, there's still quite a margin between where we are in the consequence of this change and what is actually happening in other environments. How do you respond to those observations?
Well, I would disagree that the US has taken bolder measures. I don't think they have, actually. I mean, the latest package they've announced is to implement Basel 3.1, which obviously we're doing as well. We've published a number of comparisons. We've actually, in the latest numbers, compared the leverage ratio comparisons. The leverage ratio is actually higher for international banks. So I would disagree on that point that the US has done bolder things. Actually, I'd say the same about the euro area. I don't think they've done anything bolder than we have. Let me make 2 points. I think I just the first one is just to reinforce what Randy said, which is we know that banks maintain what they so-called management buffers above our requirements. And as Randy rightly said, there are reasons for doing that, which will be about how they run their businesses, and that's understandable. But I think what we've done is it will enable them to have more confidence to reduce those buffers, and certainly that's our aim. But second point, we actually included a diagram in the publication we made. We would like to see the buffer structure simplified. So if we're talking about bold things to do, it is too complicated at the moment. We would like, frankly, a single buffer and a single releasable buffer. The reason I think releasability is important is that the thing that I think banks always worry about, if we don't release buffers, and if we say to them, look, it's okay to go into your buffers, we won't get upset. They always come back and say, well, will you? So the stronger, they always say, look, the stronger thing is if you're prepared when conditions change to take the buffer away, I accept that there'll be a rebuilding process at some point further down the line. That's a stronger message. So we'd like to see that. And we'd like to see it simplified so there's only one of them. To do that, we need international agreement. The buffers are a product of the international structure, the Basel structure. Essentially, we are, and Sam Woods, when he was obviously with us, made speeches on this subject. We've been leaders in advocating that. We will keep working to get an international consensus to tackle the buffers. We're not quite there at the moment, but I think that's the bold thing that should be done, and to say we're strong supporters of doing it.
But when banks look at what their effective situation is, they tell us that they never get to that amount because of all of those add-ins and overlays that actually occur. And so whilst I understand the aspiration to simplify and have a single buffer, if you like, the reality is that because of their hesitancy around the implications of not doing this in the right way, they don't, and the net effect is they end up holding more than they feel they ought to. And that is a persistent narrative that they bring to us, and members of this committee have had that drummed into them at private meetings recently. So I mean, you present a very sort of smooth and clear version of where you'd like to go. But the bottom line is, operationally, it isn't working like that right now.
Can I just let's take that. Let's sort of pick that argument apart for a moment. Why do they say that? Well, there are at least 3 reasons I can think of. One, we've already covered, which is that they maintain so-called management buffers above what we require. That is their choice. But I recognise there are things that we can do to simplify the structure which might assist them to maintain smaller management buffers. I think they'll always have them, but they will have smaller ones. Randy touched on this. And I think what we've done is steps in that direction. But as I was just saying, I think the big step in that direction would be to move to the single buffer if we can get international agreement. That's the first thing. The second thing is, look, capital requirements will differ from bank to bank, partly because of what the business they do, and partly, I'm afraid, sometimes because they fail to demonstrate to us, the characteristics of running the business that we expect. So we do sometimes put add-ons in. This is in the PRA's world more than. Can
you give an example of that?
Well, yeah, if they show that they can't manage risk adequately, our supervisors can put on.
And that is an active.
Yes,
that happens. All,
yeah.
Right. Okay. So we should go back to the banks and.
Yes.
And okay.
Yeah. That's doing our job.
Look forward to having them for.
I'm sorry,
Mr. Benjamin's nodding. I wonder if Mr. Crossness, who's been.
Get your act together.
They all good risk management. If they're not doing good risk management, they're not acting appropriately.
Absolutely. I mean, they can also get higher capital requirements bank by bank because, for instance, they have greater concentrations of risk in particular activities. That's, again, a reflection of the risk they're taking. So that's the second point. And then the third point is sort of the fundamental one. I think many of them still think that 13 is too high. Now, I want to come back to points I made actually early on to the chair's question. We will have a strong banking system, and they will earn strong returns if they are, well capitalised. They are lending into a strong economy, and they are earning the returns. Now, I think the evidence is that they are in a strong position. I mean, look, there are a lot of complaints, frankly, about how much they're earning. Yeah. I've said, look, they have to earn their cost of capital. They are doing that, actually doing somewhat more than that. That's a sign of their resilience. So, the capital system does support their resilience. I mean, they don't they will never say that to you. I'm afraid the odds of us getting them ever to say that, no, it's not going to happen. But I'm afraid it is a fact. They are supported by that. If they have weak capital, they will not be supported in that sense.
But what it feels like to them is that there'll be a move forward in one area, and then, for example, Sam Woods did not include the exclusion of unencumbered gilts when looking at the regional, leverage ratio denominator.
But that's not in Basel. Basel does not. Nobody does that. The US doesn't do that. I mean, excluding gilts from the leverage ratio, I know they'd like it, but frankly, that's not in Basel. It would be contrary to Basel, and nobody does that.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Did Mr. Krosner, did you want to come in? You look like you were getting
So
animated.
I think this is one of the reasons why we have stress tests to and make sure that they do have appropriate risk management. And most banks do pass the stress test now. So it's not we're setting a barrier or a hurdle that is so high that is unattainable that no one can get an A in the class. Now most of the banks are getting an A in that, so they know how to achieve that. And I think it's completely appropriate that if they are taking undue risks, then they should have add-ons. Yeah. If they have processes in place and sufficient capital and appropriate risk management, then they are free from that.
But the fact that major UK institutions have an effective requirement closer to 14.25% rather than 13% in reality is really just a function of them not operationalising risk management appropriately.
Well, it will come down when Basel 3.1. I mean, part of this is that Basel 3.1 will reduce that. Because remember, when we went,
it's work in progress.
When we went from 14, look, when we went from 14 to 13, we were actually marrying up top down and bottom up. The FPC does top down, PRA does bottom up. The bottom up element is coming down, consistent with 14 to 13, and a good part of that is Basel 3.1, and that's why the FPC felt it was sensible to match the top down.
Could I ask you, Mr. Krosner, about this? What the banks tell us about the apparent gap with the US that the governor pushed back on. I mean, what some of them have said to us is that the UK banks now face a 190 base point capital premium compared to their US competitors. Now, you can dispute the quantum of that, but do you recognise anything like that, or any meaningful difference between the US and the UK?
Many different ways to calculate those sorts of comparisons.
Yeah, and that's how you sort of get out of jail on this subject.
Yes. And also, one of the challenges also is that just accounting is very different for like what are considered bank assets, and so that becomes a challenge to do the international comparisons. I think we've been trying to undertake a review to. And obviously, what we put into our reports is looking at international comparisons. The UK is a major global financial center, and it has to be competitive. And I think we very much take that into account. I'm very cognizant of that and bring that into the discussions. But then when we get into the specifics, where there's 190 basis points or minus 10 basis points, that becomes a bit more of an art than a science.
Do you think we'll ever get to a point where it will be apples and apples, and you can make a reasonable comparison, and we'll stop receiving all these representations from the banks?
It might be worth, Nat may want to come in, because we published, obviously, in December, a detailed, I think the most detailed comparison. Yeah. You've looked at the feedback that we've had, which is where they make these points to us.
That's right, and there has been a range of feedback coming from absolutely different sides, so I think the fact is that with the package we have now set out, this brings in line UK capital requirements with requirements in other jurisdictions, and in a way that is consistent with the analysis that we did and consistent with the feedback we received on this point. I think the other point to note is often US banks, so I used to supervise US banks, the US banks also hold internal management buffer above their regulatory requirement, actually much more than some of the UK banks, and yet that doesn't have a detriment to their earnings or their profitability. And there's a sort of a
just very briefly. We also hear this in the U.S., the international comparisons. The U.S. banks always feel that they are being unfairly gold-plated. So I think it's a natural thing for domestic banks to go to their domestic regulator and say, look at the others, they get away with this, we don't get away with it. So I think we'd hear a very similar thing if you were sitting in the U.S. Congress.
Sounds like managing teenagers, but perhaps that's a bit flippant.
No comment on that.
Yeah, sorry, yes.
Can I just ask one more question around the net effect of this in terms of to the banks and the bank shareholders, or to the economy as a whole? And in terms of the narrative that they bring to us is that if they can actually get access to more money to lend to grow the economy, yet we see our banks doing quite well in these circumstances. Yes. Do you have any views then on how we should review the performance of banks financially and the impact on the economy and what they do with the freedom they've got?
Well, let me come back to what I said at the beginning. I do push back at this, what I sometimes call sort of lump of capital argument that goes on, which is this idea that they've got a fixed amount of capital, and if only we'd lighten the regulatory regimes, they could sort of lend more out, support the economy, and everything would be good. Because there isn't a lump of capital. I mean, the fact is they earn their earnings. They then have a decision to take about how much of their earnings, they frankly distribute to their shareholders and how much they retain to grow the business. And obviously that's a process that they, have to go through with their shareholders. Now, I recognise we went through a period up until only about 2 or 3 years ago, after the financial crisis, where they were not earning their cost of capital. And it was very hard to go to the shareholders and say, you should leave this money in the business because it's a good thing. Because the shareholders say, well, no, it's actually not a good thing because you're not earning the cost of capital. I can take it somewhere else and find somebody who is. But that's not true anymore. They are more than earning their cost of capital. And the best illustration of that is the price to book ratios. They're now, I think, on average about 1.7, whereas they were below 1. So 1 is the sort of is the point where they're at cost of capital. So they're not in that position. So they can. I think they are resilient. That's why, as we talked about stress tests, they pass stress tests. They can make choices now, and the choice they can make is to support lending into the economy. With those earnings, and that's what, to my mind, they should be doing. And a resilient system will support that, and it will support the economy.
I'm just going to bring Mr. Blythe, I think, wants to come in, and we do need to wrap this section up because we could spend forever discussing capital and bank, and I'll bring in Mr. Coughlin.
Thank you. I just wanted to bring attention to that we've published the feedback from a very broad consultation about this matter, and not only from banks, but from academics, from rating agencies, from bank analysts and bank investors. And I think that is a very rich picture, and I think it's clear that banks will, all things being equal, prefer to have less capital and less requirements. I mean, any investor or risk taker would like that. And I think that what we heard from academics and bank analysts in particular is their arguments that the capital should be higher, and actually bringing it down is not the right thing to do. So I think this is quite a balanced argument, and from rating agencies and bank investors saying, well, we look carefully at the capital people are holding, and we want to make sure that's appropriate in order to invest in these banks. And I don't think their view is that the capital levels should be going down.
That's very helpful. Chris Coughlin, one brief question.
Sure. Governor, you sound slightly sceptical about the bank's position on this. Of course, prior to 2008, banks are making the exact same argument that you need to just deregulate, lower capital requirements, all be fine, the economy will go gangbusters, and in the process they blow up the global economy. To what extent does that history inform your thinking now?
Well, it does a lot, actually. So, I mean, I'm realistic enough to know that the memories of the financial crisis are now disappearing sort of into rearview mirrors. Some of us probably, all of us probably have, unfortunately, undying memories of it, having had to deal with it. But they are disappearing. And so you have seen this in history before. you get these cycles, and I think we are seeing this, where people are now saying, the response to the financial crisis was too great and too strong. It didn't feel like that at the time, I have to tell you, when we were dealing with a system that was extremely weak and having to rebuild it. I get people saying, but you've solved that problem, you should move on. And you say, well, yes, in the sense that I think the system is now resilient, it's rebuilt, but the idea that we therefore sort of relax the standards because it's all over, no, that's not the way it works. So, I'm philosophical. This is a debate we have. And I just come back to this point. I'm not against, saying I'm not going to defend all our rules as perfect. They're not. But the central point is we will not have a strong economy without financial stability.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm actually going to move on because we could go on forever discussing this, but we do have other topics. And on the subject of AI, which we parked at the beginning, Governor, I'm going to bring in Bobby Dean.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, Governor, I'd like to return to something you made a point out of highlighting in your opening remarks, which is about the sort of heightened risks around frontier AI. Yeah. I think critics will say, I told you so, when the discussion started talking about AI a few years ago, and it was kind of levelled down as another risk to manage, and now you're saying that it's grown much faster than you anticipated. So what is it that you didn't foresee previously?
Well, it's not just us. If you talk to the people who run, Anthropic, OpenAI, they will tell you that the advance that they've seen in these models in the course of the last months has been much faster than they expected.
sont pas mal.
Thank you. That was amazing. I must say, this week, bigger, more branded and you have a lot of voice. Borrow some of that.
On y va là? Très bien.
Ah oui, il est là-bas, ouais. C'est tourné. De toute façon, il y a le coup. Même Dodo, on reconnaît. C'est calé la vendeuse de vaccins. Elle, à mon avis, un soir, avec son corps.
de députés européens.
Tu vas bien?
Extraordinaire DRC, primordial.
Bien sûr, avec plaisir. Tu vas bien? Avec toi, ça. Merci. Tu vas bien?
Encore une fois, encore un petit peu.
J'ai connu la maman. Venez pas là. Venez. Tu vas bien? Oui, salut Louis. Tu vas bien? Merci d'être là.
C'est extraordinaire, extraordinaire. Extraordinaire.
No, thank you for your birthday.
You go on the stairs so we can do a picture.
Good.
Come around
Mettez-vous tous sur les escaliers.
On bascule, oui, mais on bascule.
vous asseoir et d'être.
Les petits, il va jamais ici. Oh, il gueule Macron d'émission. Pardon. D'émission. Non, non, il gueule. Michel, tu vas avoir des problèmes avec Sally le grand rabbin, alors que Robotti a sous prétexte. Bastille. Bon, on n'aurait pas besoin de s'installer des bonnes batteries. C'est ce que j'avais fait aussi. Ça arrête pas de ici, on s'en va, on l'a traversé avec la vie. Regardez bien, Bonsoir. Ah oui, oui, ça, mais c'est pas bon qui partira par la roche.
Je fais un bisou avec tous les invités.
Ouais. Là, en quoi ça va?
Il est de dos.
Il est perdu. Ah oui, ça arrive. Ah, il y a l'ancien patron des armées. C'est ouais, il est parti à la retraite. Et normalement, ça fait tant qu'il est là, il est là. Il est touriste et... Tenez bon, nous arrivons. Une belle photo de... Il est entouré de ses généraux. badge presse accrédité, s'il vous plaît. Merci. Merci.
Bon, mais il n'y avait pas de mystique. Son drapeau était bien présent. Mais on avait oublié personne, il n'y a pas de mystique. Non, Starmer devait partir vite. Oui, exactement. Ah bah le bleu, oui. Patricia, elle n'est pas là, Miralette?
Non, il est un petit peu libre.
Ah bah, tu vas aller d'accord. Comment ça va? Parce qu'elle s'est battue pour vous, hein. Ça va? Vous allez bien? Bonjour, pardon. Ça va? Bonjour. Vous allez bien? Alors venez, venez. On devra aller les voir là-bas. Venez, venez.
Ça va, tout le monde rentre, c'est bon?
Parfait. S'il vous plaît, juste ici. 1, 2, 3. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup. D'avoir été là.
Oui,
Brigitte, attends 2 secondes, on va aller les voir, mais on va embrasser Alexis.
Allez-y, greffez-vous, madame. Voilà.
Brigitte, viens voir 2 secondes. Viens avec nous. Faites là 2 secondes. Avec la photo pour avec Valérie. Et puis après.
Il est là. Il est là.
C'est dans le grand radin. C'est le grand radin.
Raïm Garcia. Ouais. Je l'ai fait venir.
J'ai tous les jours.
Ouais, c'est vrai.
Il était à Brienne hier, le 12 on a fait Dreyfus. On s'est fait un truc
Mais il était pas encore passé. Fais gaffe parfois quand je dans ton bureau.
Pas très contrôlé.
Apparemment, il y a...
On y va, venez, on va aller les voir.
Attends, on va faire une politique avec nos amis avec...
Des militants.
Où il est mon step, dis donc? Gris. Non, non, je l'ai prêté. Je l'ai prêté. Ouais, ça doit être le mien.
C'est bon. Merci. Allez,
Merci Macron, merci Macron, merci. Merci Macron, merci Macron, merci. Merci Macron, merci Macron, merci. Merci Macron, merci Macron, merci.
1 milliard de merci. Renaissance, la ronde, Avignon, beaucoup.
Je peux prendre d'un grand plaisir. Merci, voilà.
T'es encore plus connu.
Au revoir, président. Océane, merci bien avec le président. Bravo, Océane. Excellent, super.
Mais national ici, national ici.
Merci, monsieur le président. Merci beaucoup.
Merci à vous.
On vous aime.
Gracieux.
Voilà, on va y arriver.
Président, il y a des pupilles de nation qui veulent faire une photo avec vous.
À mes collègues.
Il y a des pupilles qui veulent faire la photo avec le président, des pupilles de la nation.
Est-ce que vous êtes un exemple? Moi j'ai 49 ans. Moi j'ai jeune. Moi j'ai 57 ans. Ah, il y a un mois. Oui. Non, un peu plus. Oui, mais quand je regarde vos choses,
L'élégance, mais
et merci au GSPR. Ah oui, oui, un travail fabuleux. Merci au GSPR. Accompagné du STLP. Ah oui. Merci au GSPR. Merci à vous. Merci beaucoup.
Et vive les Bleus!
Et on gagne ce soir.
Oui, je vive les Bleus. Et moi de Lyon, j'ai mis 9 heures dans le train.
Oh là 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 là.
Bah oui. Je n'avais pas accès. Avec le feu.
On est énormé derrière vous.
Ah non, moi je suis la bise, si vous avez fait la bise. Merci beaucoup.
Oui, bien sûr, mon téléphone. Merci beaucoup, madame. Les meilleures lumières. Je vais faire préciser. Merci beaucoup. Salut. Attends que je fais une photo avec. Moi j'ai l'ambiance. Ah là là, c'est là. Un rappel, il est là. Bien et vous. Merci d'être là. Vous avez remarqué? Est-ce que je peux faire une photo avec vous s'il vous plaît? Merci beaucoup. Merci à vous. Merci à vous.
Oui, j'ai moi
c'est le parfum de la réponse, s'il vous plaît. Oui. Est-ce que je peux poser une question si c'est possible, s'il vous plaît? Parce que vous parlez de ping-pong. Ok. Merci beaucoup. Merci. Vous demandez la même chose. Monsieur le Président,
Une photo avec les pupilles de la nation.
pour les pupilles de la nation.
Pour les pupilles de la nation.
Les pupilles de la nation.
Allez, faut pas l'avancer là.
J'ai perdu.
Pour faire la photo. Allez, avancez les pupilles.
Bon que t'as enfié ici.
Madame
C'était le rush.
Monsieur le Président, faites venir des pupilles de la nation. Faites venir les gens là-bas. Monsieur le Président. Ah, je t'ai fait une lettre.
Oui, merci, monsieur le Président. S'il vous plaît, s'il vous plaît. Merci beaucoup. Vous êtes toujours bienvenue en Chine. On peut faire un selfie, s'il vous plaît.
On suit les pupilles. On suit. On va là-bas.
Je peux vous poser une petite question? Pas par rapport à la moi, j'aimerais bien. Vous êtes toujours bien en Chine. Merci beaucoup.
Juste une question. Ouais, mais ils sont tous.
Non, merci beaucoup. Merci.
Je vous pose une question.
Quel est votre monument préféré à Paris?
Ah, c'est dur à dire. Président, le 9
ça va et toi? Alors, quel est votre monument préféré à Paris?
C'est sûr, parce que c'est une histoire particulière.
Et donc, tu voyages, Emmanuel. Merci. Alors, j'essaye ce temps.
Vas-y. Super.
Merci, monsieur le Président.
Merci à vous. Merci, messieurs, dames. Comment ça va? Merci. Voilà. Ils sont où les pupilles? Les pupilles, ils sont où? Il faut les regrouper. Les pupilles. Ouais. Il faut les mettre au bout. Ouais, pour...
Ensuite, Madame la Première Dame, je viens d'Alsace, vous connaissez bien. La vallée de la Bourgogne. Je connais bien tout sur ça. Je travaille à l'Académie à Strasbourg. Je travaille à l'Académie à Strasbourg. Non, à l'Académie de Strasbourg. Et je suis même l'assistant du directeur académique. Merci beaucoup. Merci aussi. En tout cas, merci beaucoup. Bravo, Brigitte. Merci beaucoup. Au revoir, Madame la Première Dame. Au revoir, Madame Macron. On est fiers de vous. Vous allez nous manquer, Président. Monsieur le Président, l'année prochaine, revenez, Monsieur le Comment on peut faire honneur sans comme Caleb? Je passe ce soir. Monsieur Macron, pronostic. Pronostic ce soir. Monsieur. On est les pupilles de la nation. Les pupilles de la nation. Regardez-moi, par ici. La maman.
Parfait, s'il vous plaît. Madame, 1, 2, 3. Parfait, merci à vous. Merci pour votre service à la France.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Ouais, c'est passé. C'est bon, c'est bon. Merci. Merci. Allez, ça marche, merci. C'est les jeunes de la zone. Le nouveau là-bas avec le... Pour la photo, d'accord. Alors pour les picards, s'il vous plaît. Voilà, 1, 2, 3, merci beaucoup.
Alors après les Auvergnats. Les Auvergnats.
S'il vous plaît, par ici. Avec des girsols.
Tout attaché, c'est relou. Celui-là. Vas-y.
pouvez aller en face là-bas.
Je demandais à Marine justement, parce qu'elle a assez parlé des descendus, mais je voulais être compréhension.
Allez, Nico, tu veux pas. C'est quel que tu veux celui-là. On va voir Nico là-bas avec le départ. Non, non, là c'est bon, on met tout dans les fly, donc ça va. Allez, je te le laisse là du coup.
Oleg a lâché.
Là, ouais. Tu la veux? Faut y aller tout de suite si tu veux. Attends, bouge pas. Vas-y, je pense que je peux y aller.
Il y en a une qui suit un kiff première dame.
Normalement, il doit rester un RJ. Ouais, tu peux y aller doucement si tu veux. Après, il nous reste du jus, je sais pas pourquoi on l'a tiré. Attends. Vas-y. Ah, t'as le mot du BNC là-bas.
Ah, les chaises, ça vous dit aussi, c'est tout.
Non, c'était pas nous ça. C'est derrière. Ouais.
À la vidéo écran.
On a ce secteur là, mais je sais pas d'où ça va. Attends. La tête.
Alors, comment ça se termine?
Vous allez vous poser la question, du coup? C'est pas mal, là.
Tiens, tu peux prendre la fibre. Ouais, tu la laisses, tu la prends, tu la laisses là-bas. Ouais, mais prends-la, tu la laisses là-bas comme ça, on voit si tu le restes ou pas. Ouais. La fibre. C'est un P2 qui était là.
Ah oui, c'est la SMP2.
Ouais.
Allez.
Attention.
Demandez à Hugo de me changer, j'en ai plus d'antenne. Oui, il m'a dit qu'il avait aucun. Quoi? Faut qu'on les attende, non? Ça y est, on peut y aller?
C'est vrai qu'on est con, on n'a pas été à l'école comme ça.